Are you thinking about incorporating your startup in the US? Pause before making that move and watch this episode, which contains the basic must know things directly coming from a startup lawyer. This episode is actually Startup Law 101 for early stage entrepreneurs. Today, I'm joined by Hayk Mamajanyan, who is a VC, also a startup lawyer, founder and managing attorney at HVM Law Firm, to break down the biggest misconceptions that you might have about startup law, share some crucial insights, and help you navigate the legal landscape like a pro. This episode could actually save you time, money, and definitely headache down the line. So let's dive in. All right. Welcome to the show, Hike. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing your time with me.
Thank you, Lucina. It's great to be with you.
All right. So we're gonna dive into this kind of a startup law guide for early stage founders or founders who are starting to think to incorporate their business in the United States specifically. And so I want to start with a question, which is based on your experience so far, what would you say are the top legal mistakes that make early on in the process of incorporation or before even doing that?
Oh, yes. Look, we see a lot of mistakes, and I even have categories for these mistakes. I have five different categories that founders really make a lot of legal mistakes on. And number one is definitely incorporation, because that's what you start with. As we discussed, the easiest path would be a Delaware C corporation for a number of reasons we discussed, but sometimes you want to maybe dig deeper and see if an LLC would be a better fit for tax or for other purposes. Number two, which is extremely important, and I see a lot of startups really failing or dying because of this, is cap table management. And cap table management is extremely important because here you can make two types of mistakes: strategic mistakes, which I will probably talk about, and this is about how to split the equity equally or not equally fairly among the co-founders, but also technical issues, mistakes such as not documenting these equity awards, or even not filing the 83B election on time with the IRS, not having a vesting schedule in place, not having the right setup to issue stock options to your employees, or even not buying back the shares from the people that leave the company early on. So those are all issues that can affect the cap table, and you'd be surprised. Cap table is probably one of the most complex things and the legal startup legal, and also it's number one reason for a lot of startups to fail because of the internal co-founder issues and them not documenting their understandings in the right manner. Intellectual property, extremely important. I'm not an IP lawyer, but we do have IP lawyers on our team. And there are a few extremely important things. Number one, registering your trademark on time, making sure you protect your brand, you understand if someone else is using it, or maybe you using someone else's name, or someone else is using your name. So all these issues are important. So definitely filing a trademark on time to protect your brand is extremely important, but also equally important to really assign all of the intellectual property that's been developed by your team, by the employees, by the co-founders, by everyone who's doing business with the startup to the corporation. And this might sound wrong because co-founders could think, oh, wait a second, I'm a co-founder. I'm working on this. I'm building. This is my vision. I'm building this. Why would I assign my intellectual property rights to the corporation? And the simple answer is that because when investors invest in your startup, they invest in the corporation. They don't invest in you as an individual. So it's extremely important for them that all of the intellectual property around the product belongs legally to the startup, to the entity, legal entity they're investing in. So again, from a human point of view, you might think you own the intellectual property related to your product, but from a legal point of view, it's extremely important that it's part of the corporation that belongs to the corporation that investors invest in. Otherwise, again, a very major issue, sometimes major funding rounds, fall through because lawyers do due diligence and they realize that not all of the critical IP, intellectual property of the startup really belongs legally to the corporation. So that's number three. Number four, just having the right contracts in place. And the most important contract, probably aside from cap table related contracts such as stock purchase agreements, investment agreements, would really be your customer agreement, right? You'd be surprised how many times we see startups using wrong customer agreements with their customers, selling their product or providing services. And this might not sound like a horrible thing in the beginning because you think everything is going well, my customers are happy, the product is working great. But as you know, it's not always the case. Things go south and there are disputes. And if you don't have the right contract, you don't have the right protections in your contract, then the company might be in big trouble, which again can end up in a total failure for the startup. And last but not least is definitely fundraising, right? A lot of mistakes are being made during fundraising, and it's extremely important to have the right support when you fundraise because there are a lot of regulatory issues. You need to understand the terms, you need to understand the legal protections you have in place, you need to understand the dilution and other related issues when it comes to fundraising. So again, 5 main categories of mistakes. Number one, incorporation. Go with Delaware C Corps, mostly. Number two, cap table management. Be very careful when you split equity strategically and also when you document those decisions strategically. Number three, have the right intellectual property protections in place for the corporation. Number four, the right contracts. And number five, have some legal support when you're starting your fundraising process.
I think this is a lot to unpack and also a lot to think about as you're starting a business as an entrepreneur, right? Because you have other things on your mind. You're building a product, you're selling, you're growing, et cetera, et cetera. So at what point do you advise startup founders to hire a lawyer? Because it seems like these are some of the things that a lawyer would be able to help an entrepreneur navigate, or I don't know, what is your advice to early stage entrepreneurs as before incorporating the business? Do they
Yeah.
just consult a lawyer or do they do their own research? What would be your advice on that?
It's an easy answer for me as early as possible, but that could sound self-serving, and it is because I'm a lawyer, right?
Right.
So it really depends, right? I would say I've seen a lot of successful entrepreneurs reaching out to us early on, right?
Hmm.
Before incorporating, asking a bunch of questions, and then we help them with the answers and try to navigate these new waters for them. And some of them succeed, some of them don't. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that the success of the startup is necessarily hinged upon how early you reach out to a lawyer. But as we
Yeah.
discuss, the simple mistakes that startup founders make all the time, we see them all the time. You would see that a lot of these mistakes, if not all of them, could be resolved if they reached out to the attorney early on and asked these questions before actually, doing these things. So short answer would be as early as possible, but the right answer is really different for each startup because depending on who they know, if you have a friend who's a lawyer in the space, reach out to them right now. Don't even think about it, right? Have a casual conversation, build a relationship. If you have a relationship, even better. But if not, try to build a relationship and then see if they can do some favors for you. But yeah, reaching out early on as you start thinking about these business issues and you realize there are some legal ways to address them and minimize the risks will be the right time to reach out to a
Oh.
lawyer.
So before even incorporating, what if, think about
Yeah.
this, like if a startup founder doesn't really have the resources to reach out to a lawyer, is there any way that they could, probably do their research online? I don't know, or
Yeah.
maybe a lower cost options for them just to make sure that
Yeah.
they're ready for incorporation.
I mean, look, there are a lot of legal platforms, legal tech platforms that incorporate your entity and provide you with a document, and
Yeah.
they do a fairly good job, right? And I wouldn't say that the founders that opt for these resources are somehow neglecting anything. They're not, right? Because a lot of the great startups that we see now have been formed by one of these legal tech companies and the documents were, provided by them too. So there are some measures you can take to minimize the legal cost early on. But again, it really depends on how, if this is the first time you're doing it, it's the first
Mm.
time you haven't done any research, you don't even know where to start, then, maybe talking to a lawyer is a good idea. But if you have a lawyer friend and they kind of told you what to do, and then you can go to a platform that provides those services for much cheaper, then why not? That would be a smart thing to do as well. And to be honest, when I talk to a lot of early stage startup founders and when they raise these concerns with respect to the fees, I always tell them they're these options and they're viable options. And I even sometimes tell them this is a better option for you than talking to us, because it looks like you have all the answers. It looks like you have enough information to really go to these platforms and get it done. Or sometimes you can combine both, right? You can engage a lawyer and go to these platforms and form the entity and then just ask some questions when needed, if the lawyer is okay with that. Not everyone will be okay with that, but if someone's okay with that, if you happen to find someone like that, we do it all the time, then they can come to you with questions, and then you help them to really prepare these documents at a much lower cost than if we were to do it.
Right, right. That makes sense. And so, just to get down to basics, you talked a lot about different things, but one of them was, let's say, incorporating a legal entity. Like you mentioned, an LLC. If I am a startup and I'm thinking about incorporation, what are some of the basic types of, I don't know, S corp, C corp, LLC, and how can I differentiate just on a very basic level? What would you say, like, are some of the rules of thumbs of thinking about incorporation, and what would be the option for startup founders?
Absolutely. Incorporation is the first step, so it's very important. And it's one of I have 5 categories of different aspects of startup law and how people make mistakes on them all the time. And incorporation is number one, right? Not surprising, because it's the first step that you take when you start a legal entity. And look, easy question, very short. Delaware C corps. Delaware C corps are the best entities to start a startup for, because why Delaware? Because they're founder friendly, and investors and their lawyers understand the Delaware law very well. That's the standard law for most of the corporate transactions. It's especially good for enterprises that are set to grow and then eventually have an exit in terms of an M&A deal, an acquisition, or an IPO. So Delaware would be standard. I see some people going to California as well. Some people do Wyoming sometimes, but I still think that Delaware still is the best for this specific type of enterprises that are high growth, high value, and then eventually they eye an exit through an M&A deal or through an IPO. So if that's your goal, and that's pretty much everyone's goal when you start a startup, then Delaware C Corp would be the right legal entity type to start with. Sometimes there are some exceptions where you want to start with an LLC and then switch to a C corporation. But there is one entity type that I would never recommend for any startup founder to go with, and that's the S corp. And that's very confusing, right? Because S corps are great for a lot of other business types. They're great for professionals that provide services, professional services. They're great for solo entrepreneurs, but they're not great for startups. Why? Because number one, there are some huge tax advantages that you can't get in an S corp. Number two, venture capital funds cannot invest in pass-through entities, and S corp is a pass-through entity. Plus, S corps cannot have preferred shares. S corps cannot have more than a certain number of shareholders or investors. So there are a lot of limitations that come with the pass-through nature of S corps that don't really fit the purpose of a tech startup. And because of that, S corps are pretty bad for any tech startup. And look, you asked me to share stories, and this is one of the stories, right? It's like you see this all the time, how founders come to us and they're like, oh, we have an S corp.
Yeah.
And we're like, oh man, that's bad. That's bad. Why it's bad? Because it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of resources to try to fix that. And there are no guarantees. Sometimes you can't
Mhm.
even fix that. Sometimes you try to fix it, but it's more like a half measure than a measure that will really rectify all the mistakes that have been made. So definitely don't do an S corp. And if you do an S corp, reach out. If you have an S corp as a startup, definitely reach out to a lawyer to see how you can restructure your entity in order to have access to the full benefits of Delaware C corporations for tax and other purposes as well.
So, do I understand this correctly? If you're an LLC, if you started incorporated as an LLC and then you made a switch to C Corp, that's possible, that's easier
It is
versus if.
possible.
Mhm,
It's easier, and there are ways to get the same benefits depending on the circumstances. With
mhm,
the S corp, it's much more restricted, and you might not be able to really get the full benefits of Delaware C corps if you have an S corp to begin with.
mhm. Okay, got it. So if you're a tech startup um, who is intending to raise money, especially from VCs, then definitely Delaware C Corp is the best way
Yes,
to go. Okay.
that's the easiest choice you can make for sure.
You also talked about a little bit as you're incorporating, you need to think about some of the founder co-founder relationship and how that would be put on paper, right? So I have a question, which is more like even before a lawyer does that, or even before you think about the incorporation and then all of the legal documents related to the relationship of the co-founders, what is the conversation? What are some of the points that you could cover in a conversation as a co-founder sit down together and think about some of the important points before talking to a lawyer. What advice would you give to co-founders in those early stages?
Yeah, that's a tough one because it's not necessarily a legal conversation. So I usually don't really get into these details, especially among the co-founders, because it's sometimes it's personal, they're friends for a long time and they trust each other.
Yeah.
We usually get into the picture when there's some issues, right? And then everything is already not necessarily already finished, but they're not on the best terms with each other. But one thing that I can really probably put a pin on would be situations where you have early investors as co-founders, right? Sometimes you need $1 million very fast to start a business, and then you have two friends, they give you $500,000 each, and you are the main founder who's going to do the work, who's going to build the product, sell it, market it, do all the important stuff to build the successful startup. And then sometimes people think that if there are three founders, and no matter what the function of these founders are, they're just going to split it equally between three partners. And that's not a great idea. That's not a good idea because you really need to split the equity not early on, not based on the capital contributions, the cash that an angel investor or a friend could have invested to help you out, but more on the actual services and the value that each individual co-founder brings to the table. In this case, it could be the tech expertise, it could be the sales, it could be marketing, it could be operations, it could be a lot of other things. And it could be leadership, right? Sometimes you see that the CEO is not necessarily a tech guy or the operations guy, but is someone who's really good at effective communication and is a great leader for the startup. So really think about all these different uh, aspects and try to make sure that you end up in a situation where everyone's happy, and definitely make sure that everyone vests their shares over at least 3 to 4 years, because things happen. And if the partnership breaks down and someone wants to leave, you don't want them to take 25% of the company with them. You want to make sure that they get to keep only the vested portion, the portion they earned by providing their services, versus the entire 25%, let's say, which would be disastrous for any startup,
Mhm.
because all of a sudden you have that equity, meaning that you have 25% of your company in someone's hand that doesn't really do anything to help the startup to grow and continue building the product and selling it.
That makes sense. This is interesting. You said value and like you need to kind of put a number, on the value that each co-founder is bringing to the startup, but it's such a hard thing to do. Am I right in this case, a lawyer would help in identifying what each co-founder brings to the table, or are there any ways that you would do that?
Not necessarily. I would say that just like in almost everything else in this life, it really comes down to the ambition of each individual co-founder. And ambition is great in certain ways, and it also can be disastrous. It can end startups as well. So really, whoever takes on the most responsibilities should
Mhm.
probably get the highest stake in the startup, and that just makes sense. That's common sense. I do more, and especially if those are the important things for the startup. But then you would think that the tech person would be the most important one because they're building the product. Not necessarily. A lot of times it's the person who understands the industry, is the person who maybe hacked the industry in the past and now they're trying to disrupt it in a different way. So it really depends on individual cases. Sometimes, someone who has the tech expertise is also the one who has the industry expertise. So it's very, very unique to each startup, and everyone should be looking into this on a case by case basis, and try to understand what works for them individually and also for the group, which is super important because, again, as I said, ambition can help to drive things. Ambition can help to motivate people, but ambition can also kill the team because if someone realizes that they were just wrong to let someone have more than they're supposed to. And it happens all the time, right? You realize you gave someone 40%, and you're like, this guy doesn't deserve 40%. And
Oh.
that's where really the vesting becomes extremely important, because you can really at least minimize some of the risks of giving too much to a co-founder without thinking about it. And then if they leave in a year or 2 or 6 months, at least you have a way to take back the majority of their shares.
And this is where the contract comes in as well, right? So you would probably have a contract if you leave within the next 6 months and this happens. Like, so just putting down on paper everything, every type of scenario that might happen. And I think that's a
Absolutely.
smart thing to do. So if you don't have a lawyer, but if you come up with a contract and you sign it, is it legally enforced in general? But if without any supervision
Yeah.
of a lawyer or anything like that?
I mean, look, it depends on what you're signing, right? If you're signing something that has been drafted by the co-founders and there are some provisions that are unenforceable for whatever reason,
Mhm.
then it won't be fully enforceable. And that's why you work with a lawyer or with a legal solutions, tech solutions company to provide these documents. But yeah, it really depends. I can't really answer yes or no because I hope it is, because I don't want people to lose their dream over a wrong contract, but it's not guaranteed because you don't know the terms. You don't have the understanding of how the laws work and what's enforceable and what's not enforceable. And you should always think about the third party, that the government, that visible third party. The government is not watching you all the time, but when it comes to taxation, when it comes to regulations, you probably would miss as a founder a lot of these details, nuanced details, when you're drafting a document, simply just saying you get this much, you get that much, and this is the vesting schedule.
Gotcha, gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. So, based on your experience, at what point do startup founders usually, at what point in their journey do startup founders usually come to you for services? Is it in the beginning or when they face actually problems, or
Yeah.
what is your experience?
Yeah, I can tell you that my least favorite instance would be when they have problems, they come to us. I'm like, it's too late. Sometimes it's
Yeah.
too late. Sometimes we're happy to help, but a lot of times it's too late and there is not much you can do. But they come to us early on. They come to us when they raise funding. So those are probably the 2 or 3 main scenarios. First, they come to you early on when they're incorporating the entity, and you discuss every question they have. You ask a lot of questions. You structure things, and it's not very expensive to do this, but it's definitely helpful for startups to have the right foundation early on to begin with. That's number one. That's probably the easiest way to do this. Number two is when you're raising funding, and at that point, it's a must. It's a must to have a legal counsel when you raise funding, because you do want to make sure you understand the implications of diluting yourself, losing control, all the different technicalities of raising funding, the regulations and the terms, how to protect the corporation, how to negotiate what's market, what's not, what terms are standard, what terms are a little too aggressive. So raising funding, absolutely 100% have to have a lawyer even before signing a term sheet, even before you actually sign the term sheet. When you see the term sheet and you see all these confusing terms and confusing language in it, that's the right time to reach out to a lawyer unless you have one already, which hopefully is the case. And then the third, which is again my least favorite, is when people reach out to you with all these problems and then you realize that there are just way too many problems that you might not be able to solve or you don't want to deal with, right? Because it's like you guys are a startup, you already messed up, you don't have a lot of traction. Why do you want to spend money on building something that doesn't even have traction? So maybe you guys go on first, gain some traction, and then come back to us, and then we can fix it later on. That's the advice I give to a lot of startups a lot of times, because at least for me personally, I hate to be in a position where I provide a service and at least that's my perspective, I add value, and then the client doesn't see it, and then 6 months after that the startup is closed because they didn't go anywhere. I don't want to be in a position where I make money in a situation when there is not really a successful outcome for the startup. So that's why a lot of times we try to delay and defer not just the fees, but also the services themselves. If we think it's not necessary, if we think it's not super dangerous to have that set up for another 6 months until they see they can raise funding or if they can sell the product or get some revenue in, that's a reasonable thing to say. Just continue doing it this way and then come back to us when you have more traction.
That makes a lot of sense. If you put on your VC hat on, because you're also a VC, and you think
Yeah.
about like what are some of the startup founders that have succeeded and what is common amongst them? What would you say that is?
Oh, that's a great question. And that's a question that, I ask myself all the time as an attorney, as an entrepreneur myself, as an investor, and as just a human being, right? What are these traits that make someone great at anything, especially as a sort of founder? And I would say that at least in my experiences, I've been able to bring it down to a couple of things. Number one, I would say that the ones that really have the patience to take it slow and to really do the research and understand most of the implications of building a successful startup are the ones that succeed. And patience is hard because it's more like emotional. How do you get rid of the anxiousness and anxiety and everything that sometimes even drives you to do great things? So that's the mental capacity of a founder to really sit down and be like, this is going to take years. It's not going to take 6 months or even like 12 months. It's going to take 6 to 12 years to really build this, to get this to where it needs to be. So it's a marathon, right? So they need to be prepared for that mentally. That's my number one, mentally just being prepared. Number two, it would be their discipline, right? They have to be disciplined because just waking up every single day and doing the same thing and seeing like these small victories and a lot of failures is extremely hard as well. And this is the physical aspect of just waking up, going to work, and doing it until late, and then coming home, getting your rest, and continuing the next day. So patience plus discipline. And a few more things, definitely their integrity. People that have integrity, this is their soul, right? They have to be people that you can trust. They have to be people that you can rely on. And this is not just about the investor. This is about their customers. This is about their employees, their team. So having the integrity is definitely something that is one of the main traits of a successful sort of founder. And the last one, which I think is probably one of the most important ones, maybe not as important as the first three, would be they just have to be charismatic. They have to have the right, character for the job, a good leader. And those are again more human skills. And you can learn them, you can earn them, but sometimes you're either, you have the character or you don't. So again, if we go back to my list, patience, integrity, discipline, and having the right character.
That sounds amazing. I think that's a really good observation. Now I want to flip that and talk about the lawyers. If you could look at the lawyers, and if I'm an entrepreneur and I'm thinking of choosing a lawyer, what are some of the qualities in a lawyer that I need to look for to say this is a trustworthy lawyer as and this is who we proceed with?
No, that's a great question. And look, um, I think as a startup founder, having limited resources, when you reach out to a lawyer, I think first you really have to think of your own mindset. What is my mindset? Why am I reaching out to this person? Am I seeing this person as an expense, as a partner, or just a contractor? What is his or her role in building this startup? So if you think of lawyers as an expense, then it's going to be really hard to find a good one, and you're probably always going to be unhappy with them because you'd be surprised, but lawyers are a lot of times one of the most expensive contractors, if not the most expensive outside contractor that the startups have. So it's really about your mindset. If you see your startup counsel as a partner, as a strategic partner, that's how we view our clients, then it's much easier to kind of have a scientific process of vetting them and understanding how you can work with them in the most effective and efficient manner. But in terms of practical advice, it's very simple, right? Make sure they're licensed. Don't go to a consultant, to a CPA, or to a foreign lawyer for help with local startup law issues. Make sure they're specializing on what you're asking them to help you with. You can go to a family law attorney or to an immigration lawyer or to a even litigation lawyer and expect them to have the nuanced, detailed understanding of the issues you're trying to get some guidance on. So make sure they're the right person because they also have the right expertise. And then the last but not least, it comes down to your ability to work effectively with your lawyer, and you should just test them with small tasks, see if they respond fast, see how nuanced they are, see if you like them, see if you trust them, because sometimes you're going to assign the most important and the most critical tasks to your lawyer negotiating a deal for you, investment deal or negotiating with a customer for the agreement itself. So you need to be able to trust, to relate, and make sure that they have the right qualities to really represent you in these complex situations. So again, make sure you like them, you trust them, and you feel like they have the integrity to do the hard job that lawyers do for a lot of startups.
Mhm. Yeah. So I think the one thing that I'm taking away from it is trust. So probably talking to them and seeing if you actually trust them, which sometimes can be tricky, but I think in case of a lawyer, that's probably the most important thing, and which probably talking to the customers, to other customers would also help in that
Well,
case.
absolutely. And look, it's hard. It's
Yeah.
hard because a lot of times you don't know them. You just maybe someone told you they were good, but you don't know them personally. So it's hard to trust someone, early on like that. But, I consider myself lucky because people trust me pretty easily. So, somehow I figure it out. Just be yourself. This is for lawyers, not for startup founders. Just be
Right.
yourself, be honest, and just try to help people. If you're trying to help and you're honest, the majority of the people can read these things pretty easily. But if you are focusing only on making money or only on just, having enough projects for you to be busy, then people are pretty good at, seeing those things, and they're most likely going to start looking for someone else to work with.
We briefly touched on term sheets and, raising funds, but I think like just doubling down on that for a second. So raising the first round is probably one of the biggest milestones that startups have, right? So what are some of the things that you would suggest that they or advise them to consider, or the most important thing, or a few most important things that they need to think about as they're raising their rounds from legal perspective, obviously?
No, absolutely. And look, it's a great question, and raising funding is extremely hard. especially the past couple of years when the funding numbers are pretty low. And I'm sure a lot of founders are very stressed out about that. And then now the question is, if I'm an early stage startup, I don't have a lot of resources, and it's hard to raise funding, how much do I spend on the legal, right? Because there's no
Yeah.
guarantees I'm going to raise funding, and I really don't have a lot of resources. But the truth is that raising funding from a legal point of view is a very technical process.
Mhm.
And I don't know a lot of first-time founders that are raising funding for the first time that understand the process. It's not their fault. That's not what they
Yeah.
have done in the past. They haven't probably helped other people do the same, so they wouldn't know how the process works. And a lot of times, even experienced founders don't understand the details because they delegated to their advisors and their lawyers to handle a lot of that, and then they just understand the high level terms and high level implications of these terms. So making sure you have a lawyer by your side when negotiating these deals, and making sure they tell you about the process, about the steps of raising funding, and also the instruments to raise funding with, right? And for early stage startups, that would be the SAFE, Simple Agreement for Future Equity. And
Mhm.
it's very founder friendly. Or it could be convertible note, which is again founder friendly, but has a little more protections for investors. Or sometimes it could be a price round early on, and price rounds are extremely complex. And there's just, we could talk for like hours and hours about price rounds and how complex the terms are and what you should pay attention to. And that's exactly why it's extremely important, especially for price rounds, to have a lawyer by your side. You can't pull off a successful safe round without a lawyer, which would still be pretty risky because there are certain things that a lawyer needs to advise you on when you're doing that. But I am yet to see a successful fundraise for a price round without a lawyer. So I would be surprised if
Mhm.
that ever happens, unless, of course, the founder is a lawyer himself or herself. So really understanding, having someone to advise you, understanding the process, understanding your options of different legal documents, legal instruments, and implications of each, and also understanding the regulatory aspects. But the most important thing from a legal and business point of view when you raise funding would be understanding the dilution of your stake in your startup from both control perspective and from financial perspective. What I mean by that is that a lot of times you raise funding and then there are certain protective provisions for investors when they can block certain decisions and they can veto or approve other decisions. So if that's the case, you really need to understand if you're really losing control over your
Yeah.
startup. Most of the times you don't, because there are standard protective provisions, and the job of these protective provisions is really to help startup founders to seek the advice of venture capitalists because they have more understanding, a better understanding of financial issues such as raising the new round, selling the company, giving out loans or taking out loans. So those are things that are not part of the daily operations of a startup. It's not like, it's not product related. It's not sales or operations related. So it's good to have investors' feedback when it comes to this. But if you have a sole relationship with your investor, it could work against you. So
Mhm.
understanding how and how much of the control you're giving up and how much financially you're getting diluted as a result of a funding round is extremely important. And again, this comes down to first having a lawyer for sure to navigate these, you know, territories for the startup founders, but also really being very careful with the investors you work with,
Mhm.
right? I would say that it's a partnership for sure. It's more than a partnership, it's a marriage. Why? Because you know that things are going to happen that people are not going to agree about. You know things are going to go south. You know you're going to have tough decisions. So similar to a lawyer that you have to trust and feel comfortable with and communicate effectively. The same logic applies to your investors. If you feel like that's someone that you can't really openly talk to, you can't rely on, or they just don't seem to be very happy about the investment, then say no to it. Because you'd be surprised, uh, the best startup founders that investors invest in, they always talk about them as if these are the smartest people in the world and they're so happy to be in a partnership with them. If you don't really get that attitude, you don't get that vibe from your investor, then probably it would be a good idea to either say no, or just to wait and think and weigh your other options, or to see if you can maybe change the terms of the investment to make it less risky for the startup and more workable in those scenarios.
Yeah. And just to dumb it down for the legal dummy here, could you tell me what dilution is in simple terms, if you could give like a brief
Absolutely.
explanation?
Dilution basically means that as you add more people to your startup, investors, employees, even you co-founders, the worth of your stake in the corporation goes down. Let's say you have 10 million shares, the corporation has 10 million shares, and you own 5 million of it, and you're the only founder.
Mm-hmm.
That means you have 100% control. You have all the voting rights. If you sell the startup today, you receive the entirety of the proceeds from the sale. You sell it for $1 million, you receive the entire $1 million. As you start adding more co-founders, let's say you add two more co-founders, you give them 1 million each. Then let's say you add investors, you give them $3 million, 3 million, sorry, shares. So now all of a sudden you have only 50% of your company, even though it's the same number of shares, 5 million, but now it's 5 million out of 10 million. So in order to make sure that you understand how it affects you financially, how it affects you from a control decision-making point of view, you've got to be very careful with this. And also, startup founders need to understand that usually they need to raise multiple rounds of funding. Sometimes they raise one or two and then sell the company, but usually the most successful ones raise 10, sometimes even more rounds of funding. So you have to be forward thinking. And when you calculate the dilution, it's really about not just what's happening today, it's about how much more money you need in the future and how much you will be diluted to get the money that you need. And you have to keep that in mind, because next thing you know, you lose control of your company after two rounds of funding because you were just too overly optimistic about giving too much of the control and the shares to the early stage investors
Mhm. Mhm.
without
That
really
makes
thinking
sense.
about the future implications.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for that. And my last question will be actually, again, forward looking, thinking about the future, right? Because as we're starting the startup, we're really not thinking about the exit. But what are some of the important things that, from a legal perspective, a startup founder needs to think about as they are incorporating, starting, and just raising rounds, but thinking about the exit, of the startup?
So I always tell my clients that when we are structuring some legal matters or documents, and sometimes they think it's too complicated, it's unnecessary, I always tell them that we are making two assumptions. Number one, that you're going to become very successful and have a successful exit. And
Yeah.
number two, if we make mistakes now, then the exit won't happen, right? If we make mistakes now, if we miss a few important things, then the exit either won't happen or it will be extremely hard to go through the successful exit. Because again, there are certain things you can wait for 5 years to fix, but there are others that you can't. For example, you haven't filed your trademark on time. The problem with that is that number one, you don't know who else is using it. You might be using someone else's name, which is huge. They can sue you, and then you have to pay them millions and millions. It happened to me. One of my good friends, he has a very successful company. They have, I think, over 50 million in revenue, and they've been around for years, but somehow they've been using this name, very good name, but they haven't registered a trademark. So now they're having issues. Now they have to negotiate with the current owner, the prior owner, and try to understand how they continue using the same trademark, the same brand name now for them without any big issues. So really, it comes down to looking at your company, at your legal entity, your corporation as an asset itself. Why? Because when there's an exit, of course you're selling the product, of course you're selling the customers, of course it's your traction, it's the financial success of the startup, but it's also you're selling the legal entity. You're either selling the shares or you're selling the assets of the legal entity. So having a very strong legal entity that has very good legal foundation is extremely important. Why? Because the lawyers from the other side, they're going to come in, they're going to start looking into the documents, they're going to start asking questions. How come you had this co-founder, then they left, and you don't have a release signed? You haven't bought back their shares. So now there are cap table issues. You have multiple people that are supposedly not with the company, but you don't have any buyback documents. You don't have any releases from them. The same with intellectual property. You haven't registered them. Maybe there are some conflicts. There's some, disputes. And, the same with fundraising. What if you gave too much power to investors that don't want to exit yet? So again, very important to make sure that you're on the same page with your board, and the board will have representatives of investors as well. So it's a lot of different issues. It comes down to really taking the corporation and the corporate and legal matters extremely seriously, because if you don't, the implications might be catastrophic. And I understand this is not in founders' nature because they like to take risks. It's their job to take risks, and not really fully complying with the laws or not fully documenting some certain actions is definitely taking risks. And they should probably do it to a certain degree if it helps the business, but you should be very careful where you reach that point where you actually start hurting your business by taking the risk of not complying with certain laws or documenting certain actions or transactions, because some of them you just can't go back and fix, unfortunately, such as taxation, intellectual property, and other regulatory matters.
All right. Thank you so much, Hayk. This is a very good guide to early stage founders or people who are thinking about incorporation now or just generally entrepreneurs. I appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us today.
Of course, absolutely. It was my pleasure. Very good questions. And look, my last message to founders: I know you guys are great. You're working really hard. Just see us as someone who's on your side, helping you to achieve your greatness, and the strategic partners who help you, not just with legal, but also with other business matters. So that's our job. That's my role. That's my purpose in this profession. So I'm happy to talk to more founders, see how we can assist them.
Awesome. Thank you.